Has anything ever stumped you in terms of the supernatural?
Two things come to mind. She'd been paralysed on one side of her body since she was 4 or something, in floods of tears because she could move her left arm for the first time.
I've seen multiple documentaries you've done where you're proving that magic or the supernatural isn't real. And again, that's super compelling because we would expect you to be leaning into that and persuading us of the supernatural. Whereas some of the most compelling stuff I've watched you do, whether you're confronting like a psychic that's pretending to speak to the dead, or I remember that reading you did where the woman had pulled up outside in the Mercedes, in the Mini.
Oh, in a Mini, yeah.
Yeah, and you basically, what was it? You read her, not her future, you read into her life.
I think it was that the psychic that I was challenging had mentioned
the Mini,
that she drove a little red Mini, and she'd been really impressed by that. But actually, I'd seen him pull up his car, parked next to her in the car park. Yeah, but actually, I think it's the opposite. I think there's a long tradition of magicians pulling apart psychics and charlatans, and I think it's because we end up with a knowledge of how those things work, and it goes right back to Houdini and the seances and exposing the fraudulent mediums in the dark. You know, it's a long, and probably before that, but there's a long history of it. So the only thing about it is that if you're just going, no, this is fake, you're not being very entertaining. And by the nature of what those people do, it's more entertaining. So they've kind of won the game. So I've tried to avoid making, when I have sort of, attacked those areas, rather than just attack them and make it negative, I've always tried to recreate something and make it more interesting and better, while at the same time saying I'm not really doing this. So, for example, there was in one of the shows I did, I had an audience on stage. This was in Infamous, which was a previous stage show, and I was giving them mediumship readings, right? So I say, just come up if you've lost somebody, if there's somebody that you'd want to get in touch with if you went to see a medium. And it's a skeptical audience, kind of like me, right? Because they're my audiences. But so they'd come up and sit down, and I would start to give them these readings, and I would say, I'm getting a message from your auntie Jill, is that right? Do you have an auntie Jill that passed away? Yes. And she's not saying anything, I'm just making this up, but she's saying that you got a little dog called Bella that she really loves. Is that right? Yes. And I'm lying to you, but she's saying, and so I would like pepper these like impossible information that I was giving with reminders that I was making it up. And I just found that really, really sort of interesting, and theatrically it was really interesting, and much more interesting than saying, these people are fake, and prove it, and if you can prove it, I'll give you $1 million or whatever. So I've tried to find a more creative approach to that.
Do some people think you are supernatural in your powers?
Well, I was going to say, actually, after that, about a week into that show, I came out, there's a girl at stage door, said, I wondered if you could put me, I say girl, she was in her 20s, but I wondered if you could put me in touch with my grandmother who's passed on. And I said, oh God, I'm so sorry. I hoped it was clear from the show that I can't really do it, that stuff isn't real. And she said, oh, no, I know you can't really do it and it's not real, but I just wondered if you could just put me in touch with her. Like, it was extraordinary how we kind of can balance these things in our heads. So yeah, I'm sure people believe all sorts of things about me. I think the way I look at it is a bell curve. So at one end of the bell curve, it's people that think it's all fake, it's all stooges, it's all set up. And I never use stooges, and that's not what it is. And at the other extreme, people saying I'm psychic and I won't admit to it, which is also not true. And then there's this main swell in the middle where people sort of get it. And that's really all you can, I think, take responsibility for, really. There's always going to be people at the far edges that will have strange and extreme reactions. And then, I think there's a certain license on stage, which is different from TV. If you're doing stuff down the barrel of a TV, if you're talking to people at home, there's a level of directness and honesty there, whereas it feels like on stage, there's a kind of theatrical quotation marks around the whole thing. So I feel like I can do things on stage, which I wouldn't do on TV. So that changes it too. It's quite an interesting line, sort of treading that. I kind of in the very early TV shows, it was very much like I am doing this for real. That's what I said. These are not tricks. And then once we realised there was going to be some longevity and there were going to be more shows, it was important to me just to bring it back to a place that was honest and kind of ambiguous as well, and I've enjoyed that now. I like leaning into the ambiguity of what I'm doing, because again, it means that you can do more interesting stuff with it. If there's a lesson in it about how we see the world, how the story we tell ourselves is not what's real, how we mistake that story for reality. We mistake the limits of our own field of vision for the horizons of the world. If there's something in there to be said, in something as childish as magic, if there's something worthwhile to be said, it's much easier to say that if you're not trying to make it about yourself.
Has anything ever stumped you in terms of the supernatural? Your work is predominantly based in psychology, right? So have you ever done anything and thought, how the fuck did that happen?
Two things come to mind. One, I was in a restaurant in Bristol, approaching a table, which is always excruciating, if people aren't interested. And I'm walking up with a deck of cards, and I sort of introduce myself, and it's two businessmen, and one of them says, "Oh, no, thank you, sorry." And I said, "Okay." And as I walked away, the other one went, "But Queen of Hearts, 13 cards down." And I sort of laughed and walked away, and then went into a corner and counted the cards down, and the 13th one down was the Queen of Hearts. No idea how he did that. If you are listening, please get in touch. That's bugged me for 20 years. And the other thing was actually I did a show called Miracle, which is, this is also on Netflix. It was a previous stage show, a few stage shows ago. And the second half was healing. It was like evangelical healing, people being slain in the spirit, and had no idea if it was going to work, because again, very skeptical audience, like not, I've been to these events with these big name healers, and of course people are arriving expecting it to work, and they've got a certain amount of, readiness for it, which obviously helps, and I didn't know if it was going to work at all, but it did. And again, I'm sort of undercutting it, like I'm doing it, and I'm creating these healings, in inverted commas, for people in the audience, but at the same time I'm kind of undercutting it too. But it was extraordinary. I mean, I remember in the first week a woman came up and she'd been paralysed. She was probably in her 40s. She'd been paralysed down one side of her body since she was 4 or something, in floods of tears, because she could move her left arm for the first time. And night after night, things like that. Sometimes, as I imagine, just, people with a bad back that felt better, but sometimes really quite dramatic things too. And it was, although I could explain it because I knew what I was doing, it was, what you're seeing is the psychological component of suffering, right? Like if you take an X-ray before and afterwards, nothing's happened, nothing's changed, but how that person is living out their affliction, how they live, their relationship to their suffering, that's been made to change. So what you're seeing is just a mixture of two things that are going on. There's adrenaline, which is a natural painkiller, so you make the whole experience full of adrenaline. And, in the same way, if a lion walked into this room and you'd previously stubbed your toe, you'd run away and you wouldn't feel the pain of your toe, right? Because there's a bigger threat. So that's just adrenaline. That's fine. And then, but this other thing which is maybe kick-started by the experience of the adrenaline, that this thing that you've lived out, like presumably this woman, her arm had been fine for many years, but she just continued to live as if it wasn't. And all the stuff that you build up around pain, the way people respond to you. So there's a whole network of social aspects to it, overprotecting something that doesn't need protecting anymore. It's much more complicated than simply the organic cause of your pain. There's lots of other things that sustain it and can keep it going beyond really where it's useful. So there she was having this extraordinary experience she couldn't explain, when really nothing had happened beyond she had been snapped out of something.
If you love the Diary of a CEO brand and you watch this channel, please do me a huge favour. Become part of the 15% of the viewers on this channel that have hit the subscribe button. It helps us tremendously, and the bigger the channel gets, the bigger the guests.